of Haggai.
A reading from Haggai, chapter 1. In the second year of King Darius, on the first day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, "The time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house." Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? Now, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. You expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Why, declares the Lord Almighty? Because of my house, which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house. Therefore, because of you, the heavens have withheld their dew, and the earth its crops. I called for a drought on the fields and the mountains, on the grain, the new wine, the olive oil, and everything else the ground produces, on people and livestock, and on all the labor of your hands. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the whole remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord, their God, and the message of the prophet Haggai, because the Lord their God had sent him. And the people feared the Lord. Then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord. So the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of the whole remnant of the people. They came and began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty, their God, on the 24th day of the 6th month. This is God's word.
There was a man who worked downtown, and one day on his lunch hour, he was walking around and felt a burden to create a space for people just like him to come together to pray and to seek God. So he made arrangements for a once per week, noon, 1 hour long prayer gathering. So he made arrangements, found space to do it, and had his first meeting on September 23rd, 1857. At that first prayer meeting, at noon, no one else was there. At 12:30, one other person had come. And when the meeting wrapped up at 1, there were 6 total people in the room. So they wrapped up and they came back the next week. 6 months later, there were more than 10,000 people praying at the noon hour every day throughout New York City. And what started in New York City, in that little church on the corner of Fulton Street and William Street, it didn't stay in New York City. But historians estimate that during the year 1858, something like 1 million people became Christians and joined churches all across America. Now, what is that? Revival. Starting today and for the next number of weeks, we're going to be, every Sunday, looking at different passages in the Bible that tell us something about what a revival is, about what its aspects are, what it looks like when it's happening. And here's why. If you're a part of this church, or if you're investigating and evaluating whether or not you want to be part of this church, the topic of revival should be of some interest to you, because the dynamics of revival are actually things that should be present in any healthy church all the time. And so during this series, not only are we asking the question, what sometimes happens in revival, but what should always be happening inside of a healthy church? And also, regardless of where you are in your spiritual journey, if you care about the city, if you care about other people, one of the things that we'll see today and in weeks to come is that whenever a real revival is breaking out inside of a church, it never stays inside the church. It always overflows into the city, into the community, into society. And so if we want to see justice, if we want to see flourishing around us, one of the things that often happens is it starts inside of a spiritual community that's revived and renewed. And so for the next number of weeks, we're going to be looking at the Bible to learn what it teaches us about revival. We start in Haggai chapter 1, and in today's passage, I want to show you first what revival is, a kind of picture of revival as it happened. And then Haggai invites us to ask, but do we really want it? Do we actually want a revival to occur among us? And third and finally, how we can want to experience a revival. What is it? Do we actually want it? How we can want it. First, what is a revival? Now, Haggai was a prophet in the Old Testament. His message is rooted in history. And so if we're going to understand his message, we have to spend a moment on the background, the context. In the 6th century BC, the Babylonian Empire marched into Jerusalem, conquered the city, destroyed the temple, which was the place that people went to meet with God, and carried off many of the residents of Jerusalem in exile to Babylon. So the city was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, the people were carried away in exile. A few decades later, the Persian Empire came and conquered the Babylonian Empire. And the Persian kings, Darius is one of them, said to the exiles, you can go home. Go back to your city, rebuild your city, rebuild your temple. So the people left Babylon and they went back to Jerusalem. And when they first got home, there was initial excitement. There was enthusiasm. Yes, build the temple, build the city, we're home. And when they actually evaluated the work that was in front of them, that initial excitement turned into a bit of disillusionment. To rebuild the temple? To take this pile of rubble and turn it into the house of God? That's going to be a lot of work. And so their initial excitement turned into lethargy and apathy. And the people said, instead, we're going to focus on our own houses. We're going to take care of ourselves. We're going to get our own situation sorted. And that's where the prophet Haggai's message begins. They had been home for about 15 years. The temple was still in ruins. And in verses 1 through 11 of the passage, Haggai preaches, he gives a message, and he says in some, we're going to come back to this, but in some he says, what are you doing? Your priorities are all off. God's house, the place of his dwelling among you, is in rubble, while each of you is busy, verse 4, with your own houses. Haggai is gently but forcefully exposing their selfishness and their confused spiritual priorities. And that's what makes the end of chapter 1 so amazing. Because when you get to verse 12 in the end, what you see is everything changes. They experienced revival. When Haggai preached, God came down in such a way that there was a revival. Now, let me give you a definition for revival. We're going to keep coming back to this over the next number of weeks, and we'll unpack and unfold various aspects of it. But here's our working definition of revival. A revival is an unusually intense experience of ordinary grace that a community of people experience at the same time, with the result that their city is changed. A revival is something that happens to a community at the same time where they experience with unusual intensity the ordinary grace of God. And that experience of grace that starts among them flows from them into their city. Now, we're going to come back to that definition over the next number of weeks, but Haggai actually gives us a pretty comprehensive picture of revival in verses 12 through 15. So let me show you. First, you notice in verse 12 and 14 that the entire community is affected. So it says, Zerubbabel, he was the governor, the political leader, he responded. And so did Joshua. He was the priest in charge, the high priest. He was the spiritual leader. But notice it says also the whole remnant of the people. What made this a revival was not just that a couple of people were responding, and not just that the leaders were responding, but everybody was drawn in. There was a kind of collective response to God. Notice also, not just was it communal, but there was renewal in their attitudes and in their actions. So verse 12 says, they feared the Lord. That's a renewal of attitude. In the Bible, the phrase or the idea of fearing God never means being scared or frightened of him. To fear the Lord means to begin to relate to him rightly. What happened to Haggai and what can happen in spiritual communities, what happened in Haggai's day, is people started taking God for granted. God, for these people, had become like a really high-functioning executive assistant. You go to him when you need help, you go to him for support or for guidance, but there are parts of your life that are walled off from him. For the people in Haggai's day, and for many religious people in our world today, God becomes like a really important accessory in your life, but not supreme. He's kind of more coach than king. But when you fear him, when you see him rightly, when you see him as he is, as holy, 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 everything changes and you say, take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. Nothing is walled off from him. It's not that he can speak into some part of your life and other parts are walled off. Everything is laid before him. So they feared the Lord. They saw him as he was. And their actions, their lifestyle was brought into alignment. It says in verse 12, they obeyed the Lord. If you go down to verse 14, they got to work building the temple. Their lifestyle was changed as a result of their new sight of God. They started repenting. They said, we have been selfish. We haven't prioritized God. So they took their money, they took their time, they took their resources, and they built the house. They turned, they changed. Notice finally in verse 14, it says, it was the Lord who stirred up their spirit. One of the things that we're going to see time and again in our series is that a real biblical revival cannot be manufactured or manipulated. A group of people can no more revive themselves than a corpse could revive itself. Revival is God's work. It's God's doing. And it was the Lord who stirred them up. It was the Lord who brought about this amazing response. Now, in sum, this is a picture of revival. And notice, there's nothing flashy. This is ordinary spiritual life. Turning from sin and selfishness, a new sight of God, bringing your actions and your lifestyle into alignment with what God has said, doing so inside of a community. This is ordinary spiritual life. And when a person, an individual, experiences this kind of transformation, we call it spiritual renewal. And sometimes, when God chooses, with unusual intensity, a group of people experience these dynamics at the same time and with force. And when that happens, we call it revival. That's what we see in Haggai chapter 1, revival. Now, that leads us to ask, do we really want it? As we see this picture of renewal and revival, do we actually yearn for this ourselves? Now, that might seem like an odd question, especially for a preacher to ask. Do we want revival? Of course, who doesn't? And yet, if we're honest, and when we look at this passage, and as we'll see in the next number of weeks, real revival is a shaking. It's always a disruption. When God shows up, the status quo is obliterated. The spiritual status quo is shaken so much that everything changes as a result. And while there is for sure comfort in revival, there's comfort in spiritual renewal, no doubt, it always begins with confrontation. And what you see in Haggai chapter 1 is the confrontation is with people's selfishness. If God is going to bring renewal in this community, it has to start with the community admitting and turning from their own polite excusals of their selfishness, the ways in which they've actually been self-absorbed. So let me show you in the text, and then we'll apply it to our own story. If you go to verse 2, Haggai's preaching, and he starts his sermon by giving voice to what had become the kind of collective attitude of the people. Whether or not this was an actual thing they said, this was certainly how the people felt. And their attitude was, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. Now that's interesting. On one hand, the people are admitting, we know it's important. We know we need to build God's house, just not yet. Instead, verse 4 says, they had been focused on building their own paneled houses. Now, that word paneled, it's interesting. It means simultaneously completed houses, they have roofs, they're paneled, and also comfortable houses, they look nice. And Haggai says, this is the askew priority. God's house remains in rubble and ruin, and your own houses are not only complete, but they're comfortable. The people said, it's not yet time to build God's house. What are they saying? Lest we judge them too much, lest we look down our noses at them, remember, they had just returned from exile. Their life had been hard. They had experienced tremendous economic and physical oppression. They had just gotten home. And when they saw what needed to be done to build the temple, they were overwhelmed. And they said, we know it's important, we know it has to get done, and we'll get there later. We know God needs a place to dwell among us, and we're going to build it soon. And week turned to month, turned to year, turned to decade. And the people were engaged in a kind of spiritual lethargy, a kind of spiritual procrastination in which they were revealing God is part of our life and he's not the priority of our life. We're going to get there eventually. But before we do, we've got to take care of our own houses. There are certain things we need to feel safe and secure. There are certain things we need to accomplish to feel like our life is full. And after we get that in order, we'll turn our attention to God and to spiritual priorities. Now, notice, these people were not overtly wicked. They weren't immoral. They weren't acting in a vile way. They weren't wicked. They were selfish. And one of the things that happens in real spiritual renewal and in revival is that even and especially religious people start to recognize, hold on, God has been part of my life, like an important extracurricular activity, but he hasn't been my priority. The reality has been that I've been the center of my world, and I've expected everything in my life to orbit around me. But when God shows up in revival and renewal, that selfishness is exposed. And people start to acknowledge our priorities have been off. We start to see sin not just as bad actions and activity, but as disordered love, as that deep selfishness in which everything in our lives is meant to adhere to what we want, to our agendas, in which we use our words and our money and our sexuality and our politics and our relationships for self. And when God shows up in revival, that self is exposed and it's confessed. This is what always happens when people really meet God. So we'll be there in a number of weeks, but when Isaiah has his encounter with God, this is Isaiah chapter 6, he sees God as holy, holy, holy. He's overwhelmed by God's majesty. And when Isaiah sees God, he doesn't say, wow, these people around me are so sinful and wicked. You know, God, we need to get to work on them. When Isaiah sees God, he says, woe is me. I'm ruined. I'm a person of unclean lips. There was an old Anglican bishop who gave an illustration of this point, very vivid. He says, when you really encounter God in the gospel, this is what happens. He says, the liar, the murderer, they're short of God's glory, but so are you. Perhaps they stand at the bottom of a mine and you on the crest of an Alp, but you are as little able to touch the stars as they. What is that? It's just an awareness of sin, which is human selfishness, that we haven't loved God or others as we ought. And in real revival, that starts to get exposed. We start to see ourselves as those in need of grace. We start to confess the ways in which we use everything, sometimes even religion, for self. And so the people, yes, they experienced the comfort of revival, but it started with a confrontation. It started with God uncomfortably holding up the mirror and saying, do you see how your priorities are all off? Real revival would be a disruption. It would mean a shaking. It would mean things don't stay the same. There's dramatic and deep change. Do we really want it? Are we up for this kind of encounter with God that decenters the self? How can we? If there are some among us who say, I do want that, I think it's a little scary, but I want it. If there are others who say, I don't, perhaps the rest of this passage will convince us on how we can become a community that actually yearns for this kind of encounter with God. You see, if you look again at the text, you'll notice there are only two commands that Haggai gives. Most of his sermon in verses 1 through 11 is description. There are two commands, and these two commands, I think, can lead us into the pathway of cultivating spiritual renewal. Haggai says, give careful thought to your ways and go to the mountain. That's verses 5, 7, and then 8. Give careful thought to your ways and go to the mountain. So let's see. First, give careful thought to your ways. Now that phrase is a favorite phrase of Haggai. He's going to give it again, and we'll see it next week in chapter 2. And I think when Haggai says, give careful thought to your ways, we should not hear him as a kind of loud, demonstrative prophet who's denouncing the people, but actually as a kind of gentle pastor who's saying, I invite you to look at your life. Look carefully, do some self-examination, like scrutinize and reflect your life for a moment. He says in verse 6, you've planted much, but you've harvested little. You eat, but you're never having enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You put on clothes, but you're not warm. Or go down to verse 9, he says, you expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Now, what's that about? Haggai's saying, you've been totally self-absorbed. God's house is in ruins. You're all focused on your own thing, your own agenda. And how's it working for you? Haggai says, give careful thought to your ways. You're selfish, but you're unsatisfied. It's never enough. He says in verse 9, the things that you thought would turn out to be much have turned out to be little. Give careful thought to your ways. Do you find yourself like these people, very focused on self, job, relationship, money, morality, family? And yet the things that you thought, when I just get that, then my soul will be full. When I just get there, then I'll know I have enough. Then I'll be okay. And you got them. And it turned out to be much less than you thought. It turned out to be little. Why is that? Amazingly, this passage says, because God blew it away. Now that might strike us as uncomfortable and even mean. It's a severe mercy in which God says, I love my people too much to allow them to be satisfied apart from me. Why? Think of it this way. Let's say you got lost in the woods. You know, this is, you don't have your cell phone, or there's no, internet or GPS. You're lost in the woods. And, at first you're a little nervous, but as hour turns into day, you start to really panic. And eventually, as you're in fear and anxiety, eventually you find a sign. And the sign says, the town is 2 miles that way. You would be so glad. You might hug the sign. You might kiss the sign. but you're not going to stay at the sign. If you were with others and you were lost, and when you get to the sign, you were so overjoyed with the sign that you said, guys, I'm just going to stay here. They'd say, then the sign is of no value to you. The sign is just a signpost. The destination is what we need. Most people turn the signposts of life into their destination. The money and the relationships and the jobs and the friendships and the family and the career and the politics, these are good things, but they're not ultimate things. St. Augustine said, your heart was made for God, and you can't rest until you rest in Him. And God, in His severe mercy, oftentimes will allow us to be restless when we trust in anything other than Him for our ultimate sense of security and identity and meaning. They're just signposts. They're good things, but they're not Him. So that's why God says, I blew it away. C.S. Lewis very insightfully put it this way when he said, these things, they're good images of what we really desire. But when they're mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers. For they're not the thing itself. They're only the scent of a flower that we've not found, the echo of a tune that we've not heard, news from a country that we've not yet visited. And so, give careful thought to your ways. Have you been spending an inordinate amount of energy on self, and are you still not satisfied? Has God become part of your life, but not really functionally your priority? Is there a kind of deep restlessness that even achieving all your goals hasn't satisfied? Give careful thought to your ways. And if you find yourself like these people, thinking that the things that you thought would be much have turned out to be little, recognize it's because they're meant to point you to Him, to God. Give careful thought to your ways, and go to the mountain. It's interesting that as Haggai has twice said, give careful thought to your ways, do some self-examination, as the people start to say, yeah, we have missed it. God hasn't been a priority. What does Haggai say? Look at verse 8. Go to the mountain. Get timber, bring it down, and build my house. Haggai saying, put it into action. You want to build God's house? You want to have His presence among you? Go up to the mountains, get wood, come down and build the thing. But here's what's interesting, and scholars point this out. The temple would have required much more than wood for its construction. So why is it that Haggai only says, go get wood? It's because the people would have gone into those same mountains to get the wood that they would have used to build for their own paneled houses. And Haggai's saying, in effect, you know your way. You've been spending an enormous amount of energy on yourself, and now I want you to take that same energy, go into those same mountains, but make it for God. And what you realize in this command, verse 8, is a kind of gracious invitation. Because God is saying, you've not prioritized me, you've not honored me, you haven't really lived for me, and I still want to dwell with you. I still want to be with you. That's what the temple was. It was the way that the divine dwelt among people. It was His presence. And God says, even though you've not regarded me, I still want to be with you. It was an act of grace. How is it that God could be so enduringly gracious, like so unbelievably committed to His people, that even when they forget about Him, He never forgets about them? Haggai could see it dimly, but from where we stand in history, we can see it a lot more clearly. Think about it. God says to these people, go to the mountains, come back to the city, use the wood, build the house. And there was a man, years later, who carried wood on his back, not into the city, but out of the city, to a little mountain, a little hill called Calvary. You see, what Haggai didn't see fully, but we can, is the temple is God's ultimate place of dwelling among His people. For Haggai, it was a physical structure, but there were hints throughout the Bible that the real temple, would be more than a place you go to. It would be a person who would dwell among us. And when Jesus Christ came, he said, I'm the true temple. And at the end of Jesus' life, Jesus, when he was condemned to die, was given wood to carry on his back, and he was sent out of the city. And that wood that he carried became the cross on which he was killed. Why? He was the true temple. He was the ultimate meeting place of God and man. He was heaven come to earth. And yet at the end of his life, Jesus, the true temple, who carried wood just like these people were invited to, Jesus was reduced to rubble. He was crushed. Why? Because forgiveness always requires sacrifice. For God to dwell among his people, there always had to be a substitute. And all the sacrifices of the temple were pointing forward to Jesus Christ, the true temple and the ultimate Lamb, who would come into the world to be the substitute for his people. He would be crushed so they could be brought in. He would be reduced to rubble so that we could be invited to God's table. That's the gospel. And in revival or in spiritual renewal, that gospel becomes not just clear to you, it becomes beautiful. You say, that's how much he loved me? That's what he did for me? And the reality of Jesus' sacrifice becomes so captivating to you that God no longer can be merely a part of your life. He has to become priority. You say, if he loves me that much, if he's that powerful, then the only response is to say to him, take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. At heart, revival is always a recovery of the gospel, a sight of Jesus' love and grace and what he's done. And when you see him, when you see that, the self is gently decentered. And we say, whatever it costs, whatever it takes, I want him. I want more of him. And that's the foundation for revival. Let's pray. Our Father, help us now in this time of response to so see Jesus, the one who quite literally carried wood out of that city, to be the ultimate and true temple where we could find a home in you. Help us right now to so see and encounter Jesus in his grace, that ourselves are decentered, that we're able to confess our deep selfishness and self-absorption, and to turn our attention from living for self to living for you. Help us with faith and with humility to say today and to mean, take our lives, Lord, and let them be consecrated, Lord, to thee. We ask this in Jesus' name and for your glory. Amen.